on the high plateau of southern Africa, where the dry season turns the grass to the color of pale honey and the granite outcrops rise from the earth like the shoulders of sleeping giants. There existed, for several centuries, a city unlike any other on the continent. It did not announce itself with banners or with noise. It announced itself with stone, great curved walls, some of them as tall as a man standing upon another man's shoulders, wound through the hillsides and across the valley floor without mortar, without cement, only the careful, patient stacking of granite blocks, each one cut and placed with an intention that has outlasted the names of those who planned it. The stones fit together so precisely, so naturally, that in the right light they seemed to grow from the earth rather than to have been placed upon it, as though the builders had simply persuaded the rock to arrange itself into something magnificent. This is the story of that city, of the people who raised it, who traded within its walls, who burned incense in its sacred enclosures, and who looked out from its hilltop citadel at a world that stretched in every direction to a horizon they could not see but somehow understood. The city the world would one day call Great Zimbabwe, though the people who built it knew it simply as home. The plateau itself was ancient, long before the city was. The Shona-speaking peoples had moved through this region for generations, following cattle, following water, following the slow logic of the seasons. The land was generous in certain ways: reliable summer rains, deep red soils that could hold grain, rivers that did not always run dry, and beneath the surface, and scattered across the exposed ridges, gold. Not rivers of it, not mountains of it, but enough to make this plateau, over many patient decades, one of the most coveted places in the known world south of the Great Desert. Trade routes, long before any great wall was built, moved like quiet rivers themselves across the landscape. From the interior to the coast, gold and ivory flowed eastward toward the shores of the Indian Ocean, and from those same shores came glass beads from Persia, porcelain from China, cloth from India. The exchange was slow by modern measure, months of walking, seasons of waiting, but it was steady, and it accumulated. Wealth gathered at the points where trade was organized, taxed, blessed, and stored, and gradually, in the centuries around the year 1000, one place on this plateau began to gather more of that wealth than anywhere else. The hills around the future city held granite in abundance. Granite is not a forgiving stone. It does not yield to the chisel easily, and the blocks it produces are heavy and irregular. But granite, in a dry climate, lasts. And granite, when heated by the long summer sun and then cracked by the cold of the high-altitude night, sometimes fractures along natural lines into shapes that a patient hand could use. The earliest builders here must have noticed this, how the plateau itself was always offering up its substance in slabs and plates, almost as if it were making a gift. The first walls, at what would become Great Zimbabwe, were modest things. Enclosures for cattle, perhaps, or boundaries marking the compound of a chief. They followed the natural shape of the land, curving around granite boulders, rather than imposing straight lines upon them, fitting themselves to the hillside as water fits itself to a channel. There was something deeply practical about this architecture, and also something quietly beautiful. The sense that human intention and natural form had reached an agreement. The city grew slowly, over centuries, and so any single moment of its beginning is impossible to name. It had no founding day, no ceremony of the first stone laid. It simply deepened over time, like a mark made by returning footsteps, each generation pressing a little further into the earth, building a little higher, enclosing a little more. By the time the great enclosures that still stand today were complete, they represented not one ruler's ambition, but a long conversation between many generations of builders and the granite land they inhabited. The valley below, the main hill, held what archaeologists and historians would one day call the great enclosure, a vast oval of stone wall that enclosed a space large enough to hold hundreds of people, and within which a tall, narrow tower of solid stone rose for reasons that have never been entirely explained. Some believed it was ceremonial, a marker of power or of sacred space. Others thought it may have served as a granary or a symbol of plenty. Perhaps it was all of these things at once. As the most meaningful structures in any culture tend to be, their significance layered, accumulated, resistant to single explanation. Atop the hill above the valley, separated from the great enclosure by an expanse of lower ground, sat another complex of walls and passages. The hill complex, older in some of its construction, with narrow winding corridors of stone and enclosures that opened onto views of remarkable breadth on clear days, which were many on this high plateau. The world below seemed to lie open like a book, and a figure standing at the edge of the hill could watch the light move across the valley in slow, golden waves. somewhere between the height of that hill and the weight of those stones. The story of Great Zimbabwe had already begun, even before its most prosperous centuries came. Even before the traders arrived, in numbers, and the court filled with the quiet clinking of Chinese porcelain and the smell of imported incense. It had begun with patience, and with granite, and with the long, unhurried work of people who understood that the most enduring things are built not in a single season but across the turning of many years. In the chapters that follow, that city will come alive more fully. Its rulers and its craftspeople, its merchants and its priests, its connections to the sea and to the wider world. But for now, let the image settle. Stone walls rising from red earth, a high plateau cooling in the last light of an African afternoon, and the sound of the wind moving through granite passages that have stood, patient and improbable, for nearly 1,000 years. In the season when the rains had not yet come and the plateau grass stood pale and brittle underfoot, certain men would leave the city before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridgeline. They carried little, a sleeping skin rolled tight, a small clay vessel sealed with beeswax, a staff worn smooth by years of handling, and they walked east, descending from the cool heights of the plateau toward the lower, warmer country, where the trees grew taller and the air thickened with moisture even in the dry months. These were the traders, or those who accompanied traders, and their footpaths threaded through the thorn bush, with the easy confidence of roots walked so many times that the red earth itself remembered the weight of passing feet. The routes east from Great Zimbabwe did not lead immediately to the sea. There were weeks of walking between the stone city and the coast, and the journey passed through territories where other chieftains held authority, where smaller settlements clustered around their own cattle enclosures and their own sacred hills. The goods that moved along these paths changed hands many times before they reached their destination, passing from one community to the next like water moving through a series of shallow basins, each vessel receiving what it could and passing the remainder forward. A piece of worked gold, leaving the plateau, might rest for a season in a trader's storeroom 200 miles inland, before continuing its journey toward the sea. What arrived in exchange took a similarly unhurried path. Glass beads, manufactured far to the north along the Arab and Persian coasts, were among the most valued of these arriving things. They came in colors that the plateau had never produced: a deep cobalt blue, a pale translucent green, a warm amber that caught firelight the way honey does, and they accumulated in Great Zimbabwe's houses over generations, strung into ornaments, pressed into the clay floors of important rooms, buried with the dead, as proof of a life well connected to the world's wider currents. Archaeologists would one day count them in their thousands, and trace each bead's chemical signature back to a furnace in Persia or Egypt or India, those signatures telling their own quiet story of how far a small object can travel when desire and commerce align. Porcelain arrived too, though more rarely. Fragments of celadon, where that gray-green glaze, prized by Chinese potters of the Song, and later, the Ming dynasty, found their way inland from the Swahili coast, passing through the hands of merchants at the port town of Sofala, which sat where the Buzi River met the sea, and where the smell of salt and mangrove mud mixed with the smell of trade goods piled on wharves. Sofala was not a city in the way that Great Zimbabwe was a city, but it was a threshold, the place where the deep interior met the ocean world, where African gold was weighed against Asian cloth, where a man might hear 5 languages spoken before the afternoon tide had turned. The intermediaries in this system were the Swahili-speaking communities of the coast, whose culture had grown from centuries of intermingling between Bantu-speaking Africans and the Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants who had been sailing the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean since long before any memory could reach. By the time Great Zimbabwe was building its great enclosures, these coastal traders were established, prosperous, and sophisticated in their understanding of both worlds, the interior world of cattle and gold and sorghum, and the maritime world of dhows and warehouses and letters of credit carried in oilskin pouches. They knew how to move between languages, between currencies, between the rhythms of the rainy season and the rhythms of the monsoon, and it was largely through their patient labor that the plateau's gold found its way to the workshops of Persia and the courts of distant kings, who would never know the name of the place where the metal had first been coaxed from the earth. Great Zimbabwe's rulers understood this geography of exchange well enough to position themselves at its western anchor, control of the plateau's gold sources, and of the network of smaller chiefs who gathered tribute from the miners and herders across a wide region, gave them something the coastal merchants genuinely needed. Gold did not exist in inexhaustible quantities along the coast, and the inland plateau held more of it than almost anywhere else within reach of the Indian Ocean trade. The enclosures on the hill and in the valley, red in this light, were not merely expressions of spiritual authority or ancestral connection to the land. They were also, in a practical and unhurried way, the headquarters of a trading state, a place from which the movement of goods could be observed, directed, and taxed, where foreign objects could be received and stored, where the relationships that made commerce possible could be cultivated over seasons and years. Among the things stored in the enclosures were objects that spoke directly to this outward-facing life. Soapstone carvings, the plateau's own craft, rendered in the soft greenish stone that lay in seams beneath the hillside, depicted birds perched on columns, their forms abstract and watchful. These carved birds, somewhere between the earthly and the ceremonial, likely marked spaces of particular importance, perhaps the rooms where trading negotiations took place, or where ritual consultations with ancestral spirits were performed before a major exchange was agreed upon. Their presence suggested that commerce and ceremony were not separate activities here, that the moment of trade was also a moment requiring the blessing of those who had come before. The rains, when they came at last, would change everything about the city's rhythms. The paths east became difficult. Rivers that were dry gullies in September became broad, fast-moving channels by January, and the red clay soil of the plateau turned slick and treacherous underfoot. Trading activity slowed to a near halt through the wettest months, and the city drew inward, attending to its fields, its cattle, its stored grain, the long domestic work of the wet season. But this annual pause was itself part of the rhythm, a breathing in after the breathing out of the dry months. And when the grass began to dry again and the paths to firm underfoot, the movement would begin again, as it always had. A man with a rolled sleeping skin and a sealed clay vessel, setting out eastward before sunrise, the city quiet behind him, and the whole world, patient and possible, ahead. In the valley below the hill complex, where the shadows of granite boulders stretched long and cool across the red earth, each morning, there lived the people who kept the fires burning, not the rulers. Not the traders who arrived with their caravans from distant coasts, but the ordinary inhabitants of Great Zimbabwe, those whose names no stone has preserved, and whose faces no traveler thought to describe in careful detail. They woke before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, and the first sounds of the city were theirs. The soft percussion of grain being ground against flat stone, the low call of cattle being led from their overnight enclosures, the creak and splash of water vessels carried up from the streams that threaded through the valley floor. The city at its height held perhaps 10 or 18,000 people, though no one counted them, and no census was ever written down. They gathered here from many directions, drawn by something difficult to name precisely, the authority that radiated from the hilltop enclosures, the reliability of the markets, the sense that this place was, in some way the language of that era had no single word for, the center of things. Most of them lived not within the great stone walls, but around them, in clusters of thatched, circular dwellings built from pole and daub, the walls smooth with a pale clay plaster that caught the morning light and held it gently. These houses followed no rigid grid. They arranged themselves according to the logic of family and kinship, clusters of related households sharing a common cattle enclosure, a common hearth space, a common well-worn path to the stream. The stone architecture of the enclosures rose above this organic settlement, like slow-grown formations of the land itself, neither alien nor ornamental, but simply present, as the granite copies had always been present. Inside the dwellings, the air carried a particular quality in the early hours, the warmth of a fire kept overnight, the faint sweetness of sorghum, the smell of the red ochre paste that women used to polish the interior walls to a deep, burnished surface. Floors were replastered regularly, layer upon thin layer of clay and ash mixed together, so that over decades the floor of a well-kept house rose almost imperceptibly, like sediments settling at the bottom of a still lake. There was cattle, always cattle. In the vocabulary of these grassland peoples, cattle were not simply food or labor. They were the medium through which alliances were sealed, daughters given in marriage, apologies formalized, leaders acknowledged. A man's standing could be read in the size of his herd, and the placement of a cattle enclosure at the center of a homestead was not practical convenience alone, but a kind of statement, an arrangement of the world according to its proper values. The lowing of cattle in the early morning, echoing off the stone walls of the great enclosures, was as much a part of Great Zimbabwe's soundscape as any human voice. The women ground millet and sorghum on smooth granite querns, the same granite that composed the city's walls, worn by the same slow friction, just applied at a different scale. They tended the fires, managed the storage pots sealed with clay stoppers, organized the rhythms of planting and harvest in the surrounding fields. Patches of cultivation extended outward from the settlement in irregular shapes determined by soil quality. The paths of seasonal streams, and the distances a person could reasonably walk and return before the light failed. Sorghum did well on the plateau, millet, too, in the wetter hollows. And there was always the gathered supplement of wild foods, the fruits of the marula tree, the leaves of certain plants in particular seasons, the flesh of animals taken during communal hunts on the open plateau. The craftspeople occupied a particular kind of quiet importance in this daily world. Ironworkers maintained their forges at the edges of the settlement, where the smoke could drift clear of the living areas, and the rhythmic sound of hammering carried across the valley in the cooler hours of the afternoon. Iron came from or smelted in clay furnaces, a process that required days of carefully managed heat, bellows made from animal hide, and a knowledge passed from father to son in a mostly wordless education of demonstration and repetition. The finished tools, hoe blades, spear points, small knives for everyday use, moved through the settlement and outward into the surrounding region through networks of exchange that were older than the stone walls themselves. Gold was worked here too, though with considerably more discretion. The goldsmiths were not, by all the evidence that survives, a large or visible guild. Their work was small, thin wire, twisted into intricate forms, small beads hammered from sheet gold, occasional decorative objects whose exact use remains a matter of careful speculation. What is certain is that gold passed through Great Zimbabwe in quantity, gathered from alluvial deposits and shallow reef workings scattered across the plateau, consolidated here, and then carried eastward toward the coast, where it entered the Indian Ocean trade in exchange for the glass and cloth and porcelain that arrived from the other direction. The gold itself rarely stayed long, but the act of its consolidation and redistribution was one of the foundations on which the city's authority rested. In the late afternoon, when the heat had peaked and begun its slow retreat, the pace of the settlement shifted. Water was fetched again. Fires were built up for the evening meal. The cattle returned from their grazing, moving in loose, unhurried groups through the paths between the houses, their hooves raising small puffs of dust that hung in the amber air before settling again. Children played in the long shadows near the outer edges of the settlement, their voices carrying a particular bright energy that seemed, in that hour, to belong entirely to the place and not to any wider world. The hill complex above them would have been lit, in those final hours of daylight, in a way that made its stonework glow a pale gold, entirely different from the metal traded at its base. The great walls caught the low sun and held it, the interlocking courses of unmortared granite seeming almost to float against the darkening sky behind them. People moving through the valley below might have glanced upward, not in awe exactly, but in the habitual awareness that the hilltop was there, that it contained things, ceremonies, decisions, presences that gave shape to their own more ordinary days. And then the light would go, as it does across every landscape, and the fires of 10,000 hearths would answer the darkness with their own patient illumination, and the city would breathe more slowly, and settle, and become for a few hours the quietest version of itself. It was in this daily repetition, as much as in any single event or moment of dramatic consequence, that Great Zimbabwe existed and persisted, not through the will of any one ruler, but through the accumulated habit of a great many ordinary lives, each one tending its own small fire within sight of the stone walls that had taken generations to raise, and that would endure, in their silent and unhurried way, for centuries after the last fire had been allowed to go out. Somewhere beyond the plateau's eastern edge, beyond the long descent through the low veld and the fever tree forests, the coast waited, and with it, the traders who carried news of Great Zimbabwe across the ocean to courts and warehouses, in lands that the city's inhabitants would never see and perhaps barely imagined. That distant connection, invisible from the valley but present in every glass bead and painted shard of porcelain, would in time bring its own changes, slowly, as everything in this place seemed to move, and with consequences that would take more than one generation to fully understand. In the long months, when the rains kept the plateau close and inward-looking, when the red clay paths turned to rivers of their own, and the granite hills ran with silver water from every seam, the people of Great Zimbabwe lived by a different clock entirely. The trading journeys could wait. The caravans would form again when the grasses dried and the waterholes settled back into their banks. But the city itself, the great stone enclosures, and the thousand smaller structures that clustered around them, like children around a fire, never truly stilled. It simply shifted its attention, turning away from the horizon and toward the work that only wet seasons permitted, the slow and patient labor of ordinary days. This, then, is a chapter of smoke and grain and the sound of grinding stone before dawn. The women of Great Zimbabwe rose early, as they always had, long before the light turned from gray to gold above the eastern hill. The grinding of sorghum was the first sound the city made, its rhythm older than any wall of granite, a low and steady percussion that moved through the air of the lower settlement and climbed faintly, even to the ears of those who slept inside the great enclosure above. The grinding stones themselves were worn smooth in their centers from years of use. Some passed from mother to daughter across generations, their surfaces carrying in their very hollows the memory of every morning meal they had ever produced. Sorghum was the staple and the foundation. It grew well on the plateau's thin soils, tolerating the dry spells between rains better than many other crops. And the granaries of the city, broad clay vessels sealed with plaster, raised on stones to keep the damp out and the rats at bay, held reserves that could carry a household through seasons of poor harvest. Millet grew alongside it, in the fields that spread outward from the stone enclosures, and in the gardens closer to the houses, women cultivated calabash and cowpea, and in the wetter ground near seasonal streams, small plots of leafy vegetables whose names have not survived, but whose seeds surely passed from hand to hand, the way all useful things do. The cattle, of course, were never far from the mind of anyone in Great Zimbabwe. They moved in herds tended by young men and older boys, grazing the plateau grasslands in slow arcs that followed the best pasture, returning each evening to kraals, circular enclosures of thorn and wooden post, where they were counted and checked and settled for the night. The cattle were wealth made visible and mobile, a form of value that could be given as bride price, offered at moments of alliance making, slaughtered for feasts that marked the turning points of the year, or simply held and accumulated as a sign of a family standing in the web of social obligation that held the city together. Archaeologists have found the bones of cattle throughout Great Zimbabwe's middens and deposits, not scattered randomly, but in patterns that suggest the careful distribution of meat across different parts of the settlement. Certain cuts, certain animals, seem to have reached the enclosures of the elite more consistently. The herd was not simply a practical resource, it was a social instrument, and the men who controlled the largest herds controlled something more than grass and hide. Iron lay everywhere in the life of the city, so thoroughly embedded in daily work that its presence is almost easy to overlook. Smiths worked on the edges of the settlement, their small furnaces drawing in charcoal and ore in quantities that left thick black deposits in the ground around their working places. The ore came from outcrops in the surrounding hills, and the charcoal from the Miambo woodland that the plateau carried in its valleys. The same woodland whose brachystegia trees gave a filtered, greenish light in their seasons of young leaves, and whose dry season rustle was said by some to resemble the sound of distant water. Iron blades and hoe heads and arrow points and wire ornaments moved through the city's economy, the way gold moved through the trading networks, slowly, purposefully, carrying value from one pair of hands to the next. A well-made hoe was not a trivial thing. It was the tool by which fields were turned and grain was coaxed from soil, and a family without good iron tools felt the difference at harvest time. The smiths who produced these objects occupied a particular and somewhat ambiguous place in the social world of the plateau, respected for their skill, associated in many parts of southern Africa with transformative and slightly dangerous power. The kind of men who understood how fire changed the nature of things. Gold, in its worked forms, moved through this same domestic world. Small twisted wire bangles, drawn through repeated pulling until fine and even, wound around wrists and ankles. Tiny beads of hammered sheet gold caught the light in the darkness of interior spaces. These were not trade goods waiting for export. These were objects worn, kept close, inherited. The gold that left the plateau for the coast was raw, in dust or rough nugget. The gold that stayed at home had been turned into something else by local hands, and wore itself quietly in the creases of ordinary life. Pottery completed the picture of what a day in Great Zimbabwe actually looked like from the inside. The ceramic tradition of the plateau was subtle and precise. Thin-walled vessels, burnished to a warm reddish brown, decorated near the rim with bands of incised geometric pattern, chevrons, cross-hatching, parallel lines pressed into the clay before firing with a pointed tool, whose exact shape can sometimes be reconstructed from the impressions it left. Each region, each period, each community of potters had its own repertoire of marks, and for an archaeologist trained to read them, a shard of clay tells a story as clearly as a written document might. The pots held water, held grain, held the fermented sorghum beer that was brewed for ceremonies and for the ease of long afternoons, held oil pressed from seeds, held the cooked meals that were shared in the firelight of evenings, when the rain tapped steadily on thatched roofs and the cattle were safe in their kraals, and the grinding stones rested quiet until morning, Outside, the granite walls of the great enclosures stood in the wet season exactly as they stood in the dry, patient, massive, indifferent to weather, in the way that only stone can be. The rain ran down their faces in thin sheets, darkening the lichen to a deeper green, settling into the slight irregularities between the courses of fitted granite block. The city breathed around them, full of small fires and voices, and a particular smell of wet earth and wood smoke that is, perhaps, the oldest smell human settlement has ever made. When the rains began to ease, at last, when the mornings grew crisper and the grasses started their slow lean toward gold, the city would begin, almost without anyone deciding it, to turn its face outward again. But that turning was still some weeks away, and for now, the grinding stones spoke before dawn, and the cattle moved slow and heavy through the long wet grass, and the soapstone birds on their columns watched everything with the same expression they had always worn, which was no expression at all, only the patience of carved stone in a city that had learned, over many generations, that patience was itself a kind of power. In the dry season, when the grasses of the plateau turned the color of pale honey and the cattle grew lean against the fading pasture, the traders came back. They appeared first as a smudge of dust on the southern horizon, then as a slow procession of figures and loaded animals picking their way along the ancient paths that converged on the great hill from every direction. Some had walked for many weeks. The soles of their sandals were worn thin by the rocky ground of the Luveld, and their cloth wrappings, cotton traded up from the coast, were bleached pale by sun and rinsed gray by the rains they had crossed to get here. Yet they carried themselves with the patient dignity of men who knew their goods were desired, and who had made this journey enough times to trust that the stone walls ahead would receive them. The merchants who came from the east brought with them the deep smell of the sea, or rather, its memory salt, and dried fish, and something faintly mineral, like wet coral, clinging to their bundles and to the woven bags slung across their carriers' shoulders. Along the long route from the Indian Ocean ports, goods moved through many hands before they ever touched the plateau. From Sofala, or from the smaller harbors, where Arab and Swahili merchants anchored their dhows at the end of the monsoon wind, the trade goods passed inland, along river valleys, and across the low hills of the interior, porcelain from distant China, painted in pale blue and cream, glass beads, green, amber, blue, white, each one a small piece of molten color that had been shaped somewhere impossibly far away, cotton cloth folded flat and wrapped in bark, and occasionally, rarest of all, a glazed ceramic vessel that caught the light in the way that local pottery, beautiful as it was, never quite could. In exchange, what the plateau offered was gold, not the gold of rivers, though the rivers of this region did carry traces of it in their sand. The gold that mattered came from the ore that lay within the granite ridges spreading out across the plateau and the land below it, worked carefully by men who knew the rock as intimately as they knew their own cattle, panned from riverbeds in the wet season by specialist workers, smelted in small furnaces on the edges of settlements. The gold arrived at the great stone city in several forms: as powder in clay pots sealed with beeswax, as thin wire coiled loosely around itself, or as small-shaped ingots wrapped in cloths to keep them from scratching against one another. The king's storehouses held quantities of it that no individual merchant could accumulate alone, and it was this concentration, this capacity to deal in bulk, to set the terms that made the stone city the natural center of the exchange. There was a rhythm to the trading season that the city's inhabitants knew by habit, almost by body. The first weeks after the caravans arrived were not weeks of immediate commerce, but of courtesy and preparation. The merchants were housed in areas outside the main enclosures. Their carriers fed from the city's granaries. Their animals, sometimes donkeys, sometimes oxen, sometimes nothing more than strong human backs, given water and rest. Fire was made for them in the evening, and the scent of cooking meat drifted across the open ground between the great walls, mingling with the dust and the dry season smell of grass and granite. These early evenings were their own kind of ceremony. The men who had walked from the coast sat with men who had never seen the sea, and language moved between them in layers, a trade dialect that everyone who worked these routes carried in their mouths, a simplified and practical speech made of pieces of many languages pressed together by necessity and repeated contact. Through it, the outlines of distant news arrived: which ports were busy, which routes had grown dangerous, what the great trading towns far to the north were buying and selling, whether the monsoon had been early or late, which ships had arrived from beyond the ocean, bearing what kinds of cargo. The kings, representatives, men of calibrated authority, quiet and attentive, wearing the marks of their office in the quality of their cloth and the restrained precision of their gold ornaments, sat among these conversations and listened with care. Trade at this scale was not simply exchange, it was intelligence. It was the constant reading of a vast and shifting world in which the stone city needed to understand its own position, what it had that others lacked, what it might need that others possessed, where the next season's advantage might be found. The actual negotiations, when they came, unfolded slowly. A merchant might sit with a king's official for the better part of a morning and speak of nothing that was obviously relevant: the health of their respective households, the quality of this year's sorghum, the behavior of the rains, before anything resembling a price was mentioned. It was not indirection for its own sake, but a kind of calibration, a way of establishing the relationship within which the transaction would live. A deal made between strangers was fragile. One made between men who had spoken carefully and eaten from the same pot had a different quality, a different durability. Porcelain bowls changed hands this way, and glass beads in their hundreds, and lengths of cloth, and small quantities of foreign copper, all valued not only for their use, but for what they meant, for the reach and the connection they embodied. And in return, the gold moved outward, eventually to be carried back along those dusty paths to the coast, to be loaded onto dhows, to cross the ocean and enter into economies so distant that no one here would ever have cause to imagine them clearly. Somewhere in the city during these days, a child might hold one of the glass beads up to the light and turn it slowly, watching the way color shifted inside it from one angle to another. The bead had no explanation that any story could fully give. It had simply arrived out of the vast and orderly movement of things across the known world. And now, it rested in a small hand on a granite plateau in the interior of a continent. Luminous and slightly mysterious, a quiet proof that the city was not alone in the world, but threaded into it, far more deeply than its stone walls might suggest. The trading season would last for several months, tapering gradually as the year turned and the first small clouds began to build again on the horizon, promising the rains that would make the roads soft and difficult once more. As the caravans prepared to leave, the city would settle back into its own internal weight, its granaries restocked, its storehouses fuller than before, its craftsmen with new materials to consider, its people with new stories added to the common stock of knowledge about the world beyond the plateau. And those who had come from the sea would carry the plateau with them on the long road home, its dust on their clothing, its sorghum still sustaining them for the first days of the journey. And somewhere in their loads, carefully wrapped, the gold that the great stone city had released into the current of the world's commerce, as steadily and as quietly as water, finding its way downhill. In the weeks that followed the arrival of the coastal caravan, when the merchants had settled into their allotted quarters and the first rounds of negotiation had given way to a slower, more patient rhythm of exchange, the city entered a kind of suspended season, neither the urgency of arrival nor the melancholy of departure, but something in between. A long golden afternoon that seemed to stretch across many days at once. It was during this interlude that the craft quarters of Great Zimbabwe came alive in ways that visitors from the coast rarely anticipated. They had come expecting a city of gold, and gold there was. But what surprised the merchants most, those who were perceptive enough to wander beyond the immediate vicinity of the trading precinct, was the sheer variety of things being made, quietly and with great care, in the workshops and open yards that spread across the lower reaches of the settlement. The smelters worked in the early morning, before the heat of the day made the air around their furnaces unbearable. They were positioned downwind of the residential areas, in shallow depressions where the ground had been worn smooth by generations of the same work. The bellows were operated by younger apprentices, boys whose arms had grown strong from the repetition of the motion. A long, steady compression, a pause, another compression feeding air into clay. 2 years that disappeared into the base of each furnace, like the roots of a strange ceramic tree. The charcoal inside glowed a deep amber, then a white so intense it had no color at all. And from this heat came the first soft metal, copper and bronze, running in thin, bright threads into the waiting molds. Gold was worked differently, and by different hands, older hands, steadier hands, hands that had learned through years of patient error to read the temperament of the metal. Gold was not smelted here in great quantities. The raw material arrived, already partly refined from the smaller workings scattered across the plateau, carried in those beeswax-sealed containers that kept the powder from scattering to the wind. What happened in the city was a further refining, a shaping, a transformation of raw wealth into objects that carried meaning beyond their material. Valued out there were wire drawers who pulled gold through progressively smaller holes, bored into a piece of hardened iron until the wire was fine enough to wind around a finger, fine enough to coil into the elaborate patterns that adorned the necks and wrists of the court. There were smiths who pressed gold leaf over carved wooden forms, covering them so completely that the wood underneath became invisible. the object appearing to be solid gold, when it was, in fact, a kind of gilded thought. A shape first imagined in softer material, and then given a skin of the precious. These objects were not made for trade. They were made for use within the court itself, for ceremony, for the adornment of the king and his principal wives, and the high officials who surrounded him, and their making was considered as significant as their wearing. The potters worked in the open air, in a part of the settlement where the ground was reddish and soft, and the clay was close at hand. The clay of the plateau was not of uniform quality, and the potters had long since learned to blend materials from different sources. Coarser clays for the large storage vessels, finer clays mixed with crushed shell or grit for the thinner-walled pieces that were meant to hold liquids or to be displayed. A skilled potter could press a thumb into a ball of raw clay and feel, without looking, whether the mixture was right, whether it would crack in drying or survive the fire without losing its shape. The forms they made were not copies of the coastal ceramics that arrived in the trading caravans, though the potters had certainly seen those pieces, had turned them in their hands, and examined the fineness of the glaze, the translucence that allowed light to pass through the thinnest walls. The local tradition was older, and in some ways more severe, less interested in decoration for its own sake, more concerned with the relationship between a vessel's form and its purpose. A large storage jar had a presence that a decorative bowl did not. Its neck was designed to accept a particular kind of stopper. Its shoulders were shaped to allow it to be carried on ahead without tipping. Its base was slightly flattened so that it could be set down on the uneven floors of storerooms without rolling. Function was not separate from beauty here, but was understood as its most fundamental expression. There were also weavers, though their work was less visible than that of the smiths or the potters. Conducted in the shade of low overhanging eaves, their looms set back from the open yards. Cotton did not grow abundantly on the plateau at this altitude, and much of the thread used came from coastal trade, raw or spun cotton, that had been carried up the long escarpment paths by the same porters who carried everything else. But there were also plant fibers, worked locally, and the mixing of materials produced cloth of a particular texture. Neither the fine weave of the coast, nor the coarser blanket cloth of the high interior, but something in between, with its own warmth and weight. The colors came from roots and bark and crushed berries, ochres and soft reds, a blue that was not quite the blue of the sea, a yellow that had the quality of dry grass in late afternoon. All of this making, the smelting and the smithing, the shaping of clay, the drawing of thread through a loom's careful order, was not merely economic activity. It was a form of knowledge that lived in the body, passed from one generation to the next, not through words or written instruction, but through proximity and repetition, and the slow accumulation of small corrections. A young smelter learned by watching, then by doing the simplest tasks, then by failing at harder ones, and being guided back toward the correct motion, the correct judgment, until one day, the knowledge was simply there, resident in the hands and the eyes, no longer requiring thought in the ordinary sense. Visitors from the coast, accustomed to thinking of this interior plateau as a source of raw materials, gold and ivory and copper, sometimes paused at the edge of these workshops and stood, watching with an expression that combined surprise with something harder to name. They had not expected this. They had not expected craft of this quality, or the obvious seriousness with which it was pursued, or the way the workers moved through their tasks with an unhurried certainty that suggested not that the work was easy, but that it was deeply understood. The city, in this interlude between the caravan's arrival and the beginning of the long return journey to the coast, revealed something of itself that was not visible in the negotiations or the formal hospitality of the trading season. It revealed that the wealth of Great Zimbabwe was not only in what it possessed or what it exchanged, but in what it knew how to make, in the accumulated knowledge of generations that lived in the hands of its craftspeople, and in the memory of the plateau's long, unhurried days. When the evening came and the furnaces were banked down for the night, the smell of charcoal and hot metal drifted slowly across the lower settlement, mixing with the cooler air that rolled down from the granite hills above, and the city settled into the kind of quiet that is not absence of sound, but its resolution. The distant lowing of cattle being brought in from the outer pastures, the low conversation of workers washing the day from their hands, the soft percussion of a single drum somewhere in the upper enclosure, its pattern too simple and too steady to be a message, perhaps nothing more than someone keeping themselves company in the growing dark. In the days ahead, the merchants would begin to speak more directly of what they had come to acquire and what they had brought to offer in return. But that conversation belonged to another kind of time. And for now, the plateau held its breath in the long amber light, and the workshops grew quiet, and the day folded gently into itself like the last page of something that had not quite finished being written. In the months that followed the trading season, when the caravans had turned their faces back toward the coast and the hilltop enclosure had grown quiet again, the question of succession began to move through the city like a slow current beneath still water, felt more than seen, present in the way elders paused before speaking, in the particular silences that gathered around certain doorways at dusk. The Mambo was not dying, not yet, not in any obvious way that could be named aloud, but he had grown slower in his movements, and those closest to him had noticed how he sometimes stopped mid-sentence, his gaze drifting past the stone walls, toward something that had no location in the visible world. He had reigned for a long time, long enough that some of the younger stoneworkers in the lower settlement had never known, a different name on the lips of the ritual specialists when they poured libations at dawn. His presence had become so woven into the rhythm of the city that the idea of its absence was difficult to hold, like trying to cup water in open hands. The enclosure on the hill was a place of particular stillness in these months. The great granite walls, pale gold in the early morning light, held the warmth of the previous day long into the night, and the air inside the compound was always faintly warmer than the air on the terraces below. Here, the Mambo received only those he chose to see, his senior wives, the senior spiritual advisor whose office had existed for as many generations as anyone could count, certain chiefs from the outlying regions who had been summoned or who had arrived unbidden, reading the same currents that everyone else felt, but only they dared to act upon. It was not a crisis. It is important to understand that succession here was not the sudden catastrophe it sometimes became in other polities, where power hung from a single thread, and the cutting of that thread meant chaos. The structure of the kingdom was older than any one ruler, and it had survived transitions before. The rituals existed precisely for this, carefully maintained over generations, each step of the process encoded in ceremony and protocol, so that the continuity of authority could pass from one person to another, without the fabric of daily life tearing along the seam. And yet, the question of which son, which lineage, which coalition of chiefs and spiritual authorities would shape the next reign, this was not a question answered by protocol alone. Protocol provided the vessel. What filled it was decided in the long conversations held in the shade of granaries, in the company of trusted intermediaries. In the particular way, a senior wife directed a household servant to carry a message across the city, rather than speaking it herself. There was a man, not young, not yet old, who moved through these negotiations with the patience of someone who understood that patience itself was a form of power. His name is not recorded in any document that survives, because no documents were kept in the way the coastal merchants kept accounts, but in the oral traditions that would carry fragments of this period forward across centuries. There is a figure described as the one who counted his words like a trader counts cowries, slowly, knowing that each one had weight. He was neither the eldest son nor the most politically connected, but he had spent years in careful cultivation of the relationships that mattered. The cattle herders, whose access to the plateau's grazing routes made them indispensable. The ritual specialists, whose blessing of any transition was not merely symbolic, but constitutive. Without it, a reign did not begin. It simply occupied space. The cattle herders of the plateau deserve a moment of attention here, because they are easy to overlook in a story that tends toward the enclosures and the gold. They moved with the seasons, following the rains and the new grass across distances that the city dwellers rarely traveled, and their knowledge of the land was of a kind that no amount of urban sophistication could replicate. They knew where the water held in dry seasons, which valleys sheltered livestock from the killing winter winds, which hills offered grazing that did not exhaust itself within a season. The Mambo's authority extended over them in principle. In practice, the relationship was one of negotiated interdependence, and the chiefs, who understood this, who treated the cattle-herding lineages as partners rather than subjects, tended to find their authority extending more smoothly into the landscape beyond the stone walls. So the man who counted his words like cowries spent time at the edges of the city, at the places where the cultivated land gave way to open country, listening more than speaking, learning which concerns had not been brought to the hilltop enclosure, and why. He brought back this knowledge, not as information to be deployed, but as a kind of quiet credibility, a sense communicated without being stated that he knew what the city rested upon. Not just the stone foundations, but the human ones, the labor, the loyalty, the intricate web of obligation and expectation that made a polity more than a collection of walls. The rains came and went. The sorghum was harvested and stored, the baskets sealed against insects with careful applications of clay and ash. The trading season opened again, smaller than the year before, and the coastal merchants who arrived noticed a certain watchfulness in the city, a quality of attention that had not been there on previous visits. They did not ask about it directly, that would have been impolite. But they noted it in the way that experienced travelers note everything, storing it away for later consideration. The Mambo received one delegation of merchants himself, in the manner that had been described to them beforehand: the indirect approach, the gifts, the gradual working toward the actual purpose of the meeting, through layers of courtesy and exchange. He was thinner than the accounts from previous seasons had suggested, but his manner was unchanged, precise, unhurried, aware of everything in the room without appearing to focus on any particular thing, whatever was moving beneath the surface of the city. He had not yet let it alter his public face. It was only afterward, when the merchants had withdrawn and the gifts had been catalogued by a junior member of the Mambo's household, that he spoke quietly to the spiritual advisor who had waited, as always, slightly behind and to the left of the principal chair. What he said is not known, but the spiritual advisor left the enclosure before sunset, which was unusual, and walked down through the terraces to the lower settlement, moving at a pace that was careful rather than hurried, as though he were carrying something fragile. The city watched, without appearing to watch. The stone walls held their warmth into the evening. Somewhere below, in the craft quarters, a fire still burned in one of the smelting hearths, and the faint smell of heated copper drifted up through the terraces with the cooling air, familiar and grounding, the smell of work continuing regardless of what moved through the halls of power above. On the morning that the rains finally came, after a dry season that had stretched longer than most people could remember, the city received them with an almost collective exhale. It began before dawn, a change in the air, so subtle that only those already awake could name it. The herd boys sleeping near the cattle enclosures felt it first, a coolness against the cheek, a faint mineral smell carried on a wind that had not moved in weeks. The women who rose earliest to grind grains stood at the thresholds of their sleeping huts and lifted their faces upward, reading something in the darkness that had no word, but needed none. By the time the light had gathered enough to show the shapes of the great walls against the sky, the first drops had come, not the violent downpour of a storm, but a slow, deliberate rain, each drop landing with a soft weight in the dust, releasing that particular smell of wet earth on a surface that had been waiting a long time to receive it. Inside the enclosures, the cattle stirred. On the terraced slopes, where millet had been sown and was still pushing through the dry soil, the rain fell across the green of half-grown stalks like a careful hand. For 3 days it rained in this way, never violently, never flooding, and the people of the city moved through their ordinary work with something lighter in their step, something that showed in small ways. In the way the women called to one another across the enclosure walls, in the way the older men sat in the doorways of their houses and watched the water running in thin lines between the stones, saying nothing particular, but saying it together. This was the rhythm that sustained the city, through everything else, through the pressures of succession, through the long conversations of trade, through the quiet maneuvering of those who sought position and those who sought to hold it. The rain, when it came well, loosened something in the social fabric. Old disputes were easier to set aside. Generosity came more naturally when the granaries would be full. The grain, millet, and sorghum both, was the quiet foundation beneath all the more visible structures of the kingdom's life. Gold moved outward along the trade routes and drew other things back inward. Cattle spoke the language of alliance and accumulation. The Mambo's authority moved through ceremony and spiritual sanction, but grain was what people actually lived on, and the people who managed its cultivation, its storage, and its distribution held a kind of quiet power that rarely announced itself, but was always present. The storage structures throughout the city, some dug into the earth and lined with clay, others raised on platforms to keep the grain dry and away from insects, were tended with a care that was, itself, a form of knowledge passed through generations of women, who understood the moisture content of dried sorghum the way others understood the grade of gold dust. Too damp, and the stores would rot. Too dry, and the grain would crack and lose its vitality. The timing of when to open a stored reserve, when to let it breathe, when to begin drawing it down, against the expectation of a coming harvest. All of this was a kind of governance that left no tracing the architecture of the great enclosures and no mark on the visual grandeur of the stone walls, but without which that grandeur would have been impossible to sustain. The women who carried this knowledge worked inside a social structure that gave them less formal visibility than the men who commanded cattle and spoke at the Mambo's court, but their movements were watched and understood by those who paid attention. A senior woman whose storerooms were always well managed, whose extended household had not once faced serious shortage in decades of fluctuating rainfall, commanded a respect that was real, even when it was unspoken. Other women brought their questions to her. Younger daughters-in-law learned, not from formal instruction but from proximity, from watching hands move through grain, from hearing the judgments passed on how this store or that one should be handled. On the fourth morning after the rains began, the sky cleared, and a light came in from the east that was particular to the plateau after rain, a brightness so clean it seemed to sharpen every edge, the curve of the enclosure walls, the line of hills to the east, the individual grasses on the hillside that had straightened overnight and were now perfectly upright in the new morning. Children who had been kept indoors during the rain moved through the outer enclosures in small groups, tracing the channels where the water had run, collecting the small things that the water had moved, a piece of glazed ceramics, a seed carried from somewhere else, a fragment of worked metal, too small to be valuable, but interesting in its shape. These fragments spoke to the density of the city's life over generations, the way things accumulated in the soil beneath every surface. In the outer settlement that spread beyond the formal enclosures, the potters were already re-establishing their fires. The rain had been good, but the work did not pause for long. The clay dug from the riverbed nearby had a quality the potters knew from long practice. It fired without cracking, if it was dried slowly and carefully before it met the heat. The pots that came from these fires served many purposes, for cooking, for storing water, for carrying grain, for ritual uses, and they carried the same decorative vocabulary that had marked this place for generations. The chevrons, the hatched triangles, the careful geometric arrangements pressed or incised into the surface before firing. A pot made here carried something of the city in its form. It was not ornament for its own sake, but a kind of signature, a way in which the products of this place looked like themselves, were recognizable across the plateau and beyond, and carried with them, even when traded far away, some trace of the hands and the knowledge that had shaped them. The rain, the grain, the pottery, the children sorting through the mud, all of it moved in the same unhurried way, part of the same long, breathing life of the city that continued beneath and around the more visible dramas of courts and succession and trade. The great walls enclosed something, but what they enclosed was not only ceremony and authority. It was this, the daily practice of people who understood that the city was not a monument, but a living thing, sustained not by grandeur alone, but by the thousand careful acts that no stone could record. As the week of rain clearing passed, and the millet on the terrace slopes began to show the deeper green of plants, finally well watered, the rhythm of the city settled back into its familiar patterns, and in that settling, something that had been drawn slightly taut during the dry season began, gradually, to release. The conversations about who would follow the mambo had not stopped, exactly, but they had softened somewhat. In the good weather after rain, with the stores likely to be adequate and the cattle looking well, the urgency of those questions seemed to belong to a future that was still far enough away to wait for, and in the quiet that opened up in that waiting, the city simply continued, patient, practiced, old in its knowledge, and in its own way, deeply at rest. On the morning the traders arrived from the north, the sentinels at the valley's edge saw them long before they came close enough to be heard. It was the dust that announced them first, a pale, slow-rising thread above the line of mopane trees, the kind of dust that only comes from many feet moving together at an unhurried pace. The sentinels watched from their position above the stone enclosures, where the granite walls caught the early light and held it a little longer than the surrounding bush. They did not run to sound an alarm. This was not the posture of men arriving with threat. This was the posture of men arriving with goods. By mid-morning, the trading party had descended into the valley and gathered at the outer edge of the settlement, where the pathways between homesteads widened into a kind of natural clearing. There were perhaps 30 of them, though some accounts preserved in later traditions suggest the number was closer to 40. They had come from the kingdoms of the interior plateau, and perhaps from settlements even further north, following river systems and ancient foot routes that generations of traders had worn into the earth long before the stone enclosures of Great Zimbabwe had risen to their present height. They carried cloth, not the rough woven fabrics made locally from bark, fiber, or domestic cotton, but cloth of a fineness that registered immediately with those who handled it. The fabric was wound tightly around wooden frames to protect it from dust and moisture, and when those frames were unwrapped in the clearing, the cloth fell open in long, quiet sheets of color, ochre, indigo, a pale green that had the quality of river water seen from above. These were trade goods from the Indian Ocean networks, passed northward and then southward through hands the people of Great Zimbabwe would never meet. Arriving here as the final destination of journeys measured in months, there were also beads. There were always beads. The beads of Great Zimbabwe occupy a particular place in the long record of the city's life, because they are among the most durable things its people left behind. Glass beads, blue, white, yellow, occasionally a deep red, the color of dried sorghum husks, had been arriving at this plateau for centuries before the great enclosures were built, and they would continue to arrive long after the enclosures were abandoned. They came from workshops in India, in Persia, in Egypt, carried aboard dhows across the Indian Ocean to the Swahili ports of the coast, and then carried inland by networks of exchange that followed the great rivers and the elephant paths between them. To hold one of those beads is to hold a small, almost weightless object that has crossed more water than most of the people who eventually received it would ever see. And yet, in the context of Great Zimbabwe, these objects were not curiosities. They were currency, in the broad sense, not money exactly, but stored value, markers of connection, objects that communicated rank and relationship. A woman with many beads was a woman with many alliances. A household that received beads from the hill enclosure was a household that stood in some recognized relationship to the authority at the center. The trading party from the north carried several categories of goods beyond cloth and beads. There was copper, not raw but worked copper, cast into ingots and crosses of a standardized form that allowed easy portioning in exchange. Copper from the mines of the northern plateau had been moving through this region for centuries, and Great Zimbabwe sat at a point in the network where copper from the north could be exchanged for gold from the rivers further south and west. The city itself did not mine its own gold in any significant quantity. Its power lay rather in its position, a place where things came together, where the values of different regions could be translated into one another through the mechanism of controlled exchange. The men and women who oversaw that exchange on behalf of the enclosures above were not merchants in any simple sense. They were intermediaries whose role combined the practical and the ceremonial. To trade at Great Zimbabwe was not merely to swap objects of agreed value. It was to participate in a transaction that carried social weight, that acknowledged the city's position as a center not only of goods, but of meaning. The traders from the north knew this. They had made this journey before, or their fathers had, and they arrived with the patient, calibrated demeanor of people who understood that the first day of a trading visit was rarely the day when anything consequential was settled. They were offered water and shade and food, a hospitality that was itself a form of communication, an assertion of abundance that the enclosures could maintain without strain, even with 30 or 40 guests to accommodate. The grain stores, so carefully tended through the rainy season, made such hospitality possible. It was another layer of the city's quiet power, the ability to be generous without appearing to exert effort. Over the following days, the exchange took its slow, ceremonial shape. Objects moved between hands. Conversations were held in the shade of the outer settlement, where the pottery makers continued their work nearby, their rhythmic smoothing and incising a kind of background music to the negotiations. Cloth was measured against standards that existed in communal memory rather than in any written record. Copper crosses were counted and recounted. Beads were sorted by color and size and origin, each variety carrying its own relative weight in the calculation. And gold moved outward, as it always did. The gold of Great Zimbabwe's trading network came primarily from alluvial sources, river gravels, and stream deposits in the lands to the south and southwest, where men and women worked seasonally, panning and sifting in the shallower waters during the dry months. This gold arrived at the city already refined into dust or small worked objects, fine wire twisted into rings, thin beaten sheets, occasionally a small cast piece of no great size but considerable workmanship. In exchange, it departed northward and eventually coastward, becoming part of the Indian Ocean economy that stretched from the harbors of Arabia to the markets of coastal India. The people of Great Zimbabwe did not narrate their own participation in this system in the terms that later historians would use. They did not think of themselves as nodes in a trading network or as intermediaries in an intercontinental supply chain. They thought of the beads as beautiful and meaningful. They thought of the cloth as precious and prestigious. They thought of the copper as useful, and the gold as something that could be parted with in exchange for things that held different but equivalent significance in their own world. That translation of value, of meaning, of one kind of wealth into another is perhaps the most remarkable thing that happened in the clearing outside the stone enclosures. On all the mornings that trading parties arrived from the north, or the south, or the coastal directions east, by the time the visitors departed, 5 days after their arrival, the clearing had returned to its ordinary texture. The children who had watched from cautious distances resumed their games near the pottery fires. The women with their grain measurements returned to their conversations. The sentinels on the walls above turned their attention back to the slow movements of the bush below. And somewhere in the hill enclosure, in the cool interior where the most significant objects were kept, a new length of indigo cloth lay folded against the stone, waiting for whatever meaning would eventually be assigned to it. In the weeks that followed the trading party's departure, the city returned to its own unhurried rhythm, as though the visits of outsiders were only brief interruptions in a much older and more continuous story that Great Zimbabwe told to itself alone. The rains had not yet come, but their approach was felt in small ways, in the heaviness of midday air, in the way cattle grew restless toward evening, in the particular quality of light that settled over the plateau in the late afternoon, thick and amber-colored and slow. The women who carried water from the valley springs noticed it first. They said the clouds to the northwest had changed their shape, had begun to pile and darken in ways they recognized, and they carried this information back into the household enclosures, the way they carried everything else, in containers balanced on their heads, steadily, without spillage, within the great stone walls. There was a season of quiet preparation. Grain stores were assessed. Old thatch was replaced before the weight of water could press it inward. Children were set to gathering firewood from the hillside slopes, and the small figures moved among the granite boulders in the long light of morning, bundling branches that had dried through the rainless months into faggots they could carry on their backs. This was ordinary work, the kind that left no mark in memory or in stone, but it occupied most of the city's population for most of each day, and it was the true substance of life here, beneath and around. And between all the more visible ceremonies of power, the plateau's craftsmen worked in the hours before the heat became oppressive. Iron workers who lived in the lower enclosures kept their forges going in early morning, the sound of hammering carrying up through the terraced stone walls in a rhythm that had its own kind of music, not insistent, not hurried, but steady as the seasons themselves. The iron they worked came from the plateau's own ore-bearing hills, smelted in furnaces whose design had been refined across generations until the process was understood almost without thinking, the way a river understands the gradient of its own bed. They made hoes and blades and spearheads and small tools whose shapes had changed very little for a very long time, because the shapes were correct. Bone workers and leather workers occupied different spaces, and the smell of their work drifted through the enclosures in ways that announced them before they were seen. Hides were stretched on wooden frames and worked with tools of polished bone until they softened into something that could be folded and shaped and worn. The leather that emerged from this process was not fine in the way that the imported cloth was fine. It did not carry the colors of distant dyeworks, or the memory of looms in another hemisphere. But it was durable, and it was made here, from animals known by name, and it carried its own kind of dignity. Potters worked in a quieter corner of the lower city, their hands moving in the same gestures that potters had made on this plateau for 500 years. The clay they used came from specific places in the valley, places known to each family of potters and not freely shared, and the journey to collect it was itself a kind of considered act, something that required the right moment and a certain acknowledgement. The pots they made were wide-mouthed, often decorated around their shoulders with incised geometric patterns, hatching, chevrons, lines that ran parallel and then diverged and then ran parallel again, in a visual language whose precise meanings had perhaps blurred over time, but whose aesthetic remained consistently, recognizably itself. Some of the finest pots were decorated with a technique that involved pressing twisted cord against the wet clay before firing, leaving behind an impression that ran in spiraling bands around the vessel. When the clay dried and the pot was fired to hardness in an open hearth kiln, the cord impressions remained as a kind of permanent texture, and the finished surface caught light differently depending on the angle from which it was viewed. These were not pots for everyday water carrying. They were made for occasions, for the serving of food at gatherings, for the holding of substances that mattered, for placement in contexts where the quality of the vessel was understood to reflect the quality of what was being offered or performed. There were also pots made simply for use, undecorated and sturdy, fired until they rang when tapped with a knuckle, and these were carried and broken and replaced without ceremony, because that was their nature and their purpose. The children who were not gathering wood or tending younger children moved through the city in the way that children always move through places they belong to, without wonder, because wonder requires a measure of unfamiliarity, and they had grown up here and knew every wall and shadow and shortcut. They played games whose rules were local and specific, using smooth granite pebbles as counters in patterns traced in dust. They chased the small gray mongooses that occasionally appeared in the lower enclosures and disappeared, again, into crevices in the ancient stone. They listened without appearing to listen when adults spoke of things they were not yet supposed to understand. The older boys had begun to accompany the cattle herders out onto the plateau beyond the city walls, and this was understood as preparation for a longer movement in their lives, away from childhood's enclosures and toward the open grassland, where adult men spent much of their time, following the cattle through the cycle of seasons, reading the land in the way their fathers had taught them. The cattle were not merely wealth, though they were wealth in the most tangible and immediate sense. They were also a system of knowledge, a way of understanding landscape and weather and soil and time that could not easily be separated from the animals themselves. In the evenings, when the light shifted from amber to a deep rose and the first bats began their erratic circuits over the stone enclosures, fires were lit and food was prepared, and the sounds of the city changed quality, becoming softer, more intimate. The voices of individual households, rather than the aggregate sound of a working day. Smoke rose in thin columns from the lower enclosures and drifted sideways in the light breeze that came down from the hill. Old women sat near fires and spoke, and what they said was not written down and was not preserved in stone. But it was heard by younger women who sat nearby and by children who were almost asleep and who would carry fragments of it forward into their own long lives without always knowing they were carrying anything at all. This was the city at rest, or at least at the pace that it chose for itself, when no trading parties were present and no ceremonies were imminent. It was not a grand pace, and it was not particularly dramatic, and that was precisely its quality. The deep, unspectacular continuity of a place that had been inhabited long enough to develop its own settled gravity. The rains, when they came, would change everything slightly. The pathways would run with red water. The granite would darken, and the lichen on it would brighten to an almost violent green. The air would smell of wet earth, and the cattle would bellow with something that sounded like relief. But for now, the city held its dry season stillness a little longer, and the smoke rose straight up in the windless dusk, and somewhere in the hill enclosure, a single lamp made from a shallow clay dish burned steadily in the dark. The first rain of the season did not arrive as a storm. It came, as it often did in those highlands, as a sound before it was anything else, a low rushing in the far distance, moving through the valleys like a breath drawn slowly inward. And then the smell. Something between iron and green. Something that had no name in any language, but was recognized instantly by every living creature on the plateau. The cattle lifted their heads in the same moment. The children stopped their games. Even the potters, bent over their unfired vessels in the half-shade of an acacia, paused with their tools in their hands and simply listened. Then the sky darkened from the northwest, and the first drops fell on the dusty stone of the great enclosure wall. Not many, only a few, widely spaced, each one leaving a small dark mark on the pale granite-like ink pressed into dry cloth. And within the hour, the world had changed its color entirely. The rains, when they finally came in full, came for days. The paths between enclosures became channels of red water. The valley below the hill filled with a sound of running that had not been there for months, and the small seasonal streams that the city's people crossed daily, without thinking now, ran fast and copper-bright between their banks. The thorn trees, which had stood gray and skeletal through the long dry weeks, began almost immediately to show a faint haze of new green at their tips, a color so pale it was barely distinguishable from the morning mist that now settled each dawn in. The lower parts of the valley, inside the great enclosure, the conical tower stood, as it always stood, indifferent to weather. Its mortarless courses of dressed granite, shedding water in thin sheets that darkened its sides without penetrating them. The builders of that tower had understood something about rain, had chosen and laid their stone with the seasons already in mind, so that the structure seemed not to resist the water, but simply to redirect it, calmly, down and away. As a shoulder redirects a cloak, the enclosure's interior smelled of wet earth and bruised grass and the particular warm musk of cattle brought in from the lower pens against the worst of the storms. The women who moved through the passages with ceramic water jars balanced on their heads did so with a different quality of motion in the rainy season, more deliberate, slower at the turns, because the smooth stone floors of the passages became treacherous when wet, and a broken jar in the dry season could be replaced within days. But a broken jar in the rains, with the clay unworkable and the fires difficult to maintain, was a more serious matter. The hill enclosure was quieter than the lower city during the rains. The path that wound up the granite face became difficult after heavy falls. The rock grew a thin coat of moisture and fine moss that made each step uncertain. And so, the movement of people up and down was reduced to necessity, and the enclosure itself took on a quality of deliberate seclusion that it did not quite have in the dry months. Those who remained there moved among the boulders with the careful slowness of people who had learned not to hurry on wet stone, and the conversations that took place were lower and less frequent, shaped by the sound of water finding its way through every crack and hollow in the ancient granite. It was during such a morning, the third or fourth of a long rainy spell, with the mist still thick in the valley and the clouds sitting heavily on the plateau, that a figure appeared at the lower entrance of the hill path. He had come from the east, from the direction of the trade routes that ran down toward the river systems, and eventually to the coastal ports. And he was accompanied by 2 younger men, who carried between them a wooden frame hung with wrapped bundles, the wrapping dark with rain despite their care. His name was known in the city, though he had not been seen there in several seasons. He was a trader of the middling sort, not one of the great merchants whose arrival would have been announced in advance and received with ceremony, but a man of established reputation who moved between the highland settlements and the distant markets with a regularity that had made him, over many years, a familiar and trusted presence. The goods he carried changed with the seasons and with his reading of what each place needed, but he always carried cloth, imported cotton cloth from the coastal trade, folded and wrapped against the humidity, in colors that did not exist in the local dye tradition. He was brought to the enclosure of the senior official who managed the city's trade relations in the rains, when the roads were slow and arrivals were few, and each transaction could be given the time it deserved. What he carried this time was not only cloth. Among the wrapped bundles, carefully separated from the damp outer layers, were 3 objects that had not been made anywhere in the highlands. 2 small ceramic vessels of a type that came ultimately from far to the north, with a blue-white glaze that caught the gray rainy season light in a way that local pottery, however fine, did not, and a fragment of carved ivory, small enough to sit in a cupped palm, worked into the shape of something that was not quite an animal and not quite a human figure, occupying some considered space between the 2. The official received these objects with the measured attention they required. He held each one briefly, passed it to an assistant who noted what was said, and then set it carefully on a cloth-covered surface where it would remain until the appropriate consultations had taken place. The trader was given food and a dry place to rest, and the conversation that would determine the exchange was postponed, as these conversations always were, to a time when the rain was lighter and the attention of both parties could be given fully to the matter. Outside, the rain continued its patient work on the city's stones. The valley filled a little more. The new grass, which had been invisible only days ago, was now a faint green wash across the lower slopes, the kind of color that seemed to change as you looked at it, becoming more definite as the morning advanced and the mist began, slowly, to lift. By midday, on a day without heavy rain, the plateau could look entirely different from its dry season self, softer, more textured, the distances between enclosures filled with color rather than dust, the air carrying a complexity of smell that the dry months had stripped away. The children, who had spent the heaviest days of rain indoors, learning patience in the way children learn patience, restlessly, in small increments, had begun to venture back into the enclosure courtyards, their feet bare on the wet stone, testing puddles with the seriousness of small investigators. The oldest among them had been given tasks that could be done in covered spaces: the sorting of seed, the oiling of tool handles, the carrying of messages between nearby enclosures, along the covered passage sections where the walls of the city's inner rings kept the rain at bay. One of these children, carrying a folded cloth between 2 of the senior women's enclosures along a path she had walked many times, passed close enough to the receiving room where the trader's objects still lay on their cloth to catch a glimpse of them through the low doorway, the blue-white gleam of the glazed vessels in the gray light, quite unlike anything she had seen before, both ordinary in their vessel shape and strange in their surface, as if someone had found a way to put the inside of a shell on the outside of a pot. She did not stop. She was on an errand, and she had learned already, in the gradual way that children in the enclosures learned things, that some rooms were not for pausing at. But she thought about those vessels for the rest of the afternoon, and when she returned to a family's fire that evening, she described them to her mother with a careful precision that suggested she had been holding the image gently in her mind all day, turning it over without disturbing it. Her mother listened and nodded, and said something quiet that the child would not fully understand for many years, something about how the city was a place where the world's edges came to rest for a little while before moving on again, and how this was a kind of privilege, and also a kind of responsibility, and that the 2 were always found together, always inseparable, like the dry season and the rain. The fire crackled softly between them, and outside, steady and unhurried, the rain continued to fall on the ancient stones of the plateau, as it had fallen on them for longer than any story could reach, and as it would fall on them long after the last lamp in the hill enclosure had been extinguished for the night. The rains did not come all at once, and they did not leave all at once either. They tapered across several weeks, the downpours shortening day by day until what remained was only a soft, persistent moisture in the air, a dampness that clung to the granite walls through the morning hours and lifted, reluctantly, sometime around midday, when the sun found its strength again and the stone resumed its familiar warmth underfoot. it was in this in-between season, neither fully wet nor fully dry, that the cattle were counted. The counting was not a simple thing. It was not a man with a stick, marking tallies in the dust, though tallies were made. It was an occasion that carried the weight of ceremony and the practicality of administration at once. And the two were not kept separate, because in this city, as in the wider plateau life, from which the city drew its people, the sacred and the practical had never learned to live in different rooms. The herds had been moved during the worst of the rains, taken to higher, better drained ground several hours' walk to the north, where a cluster of smaller stone enclosures marked a satellite settlement that served the great city in precisely this way, as a kind of overflow, a place where the city's abundance could be held when the city itself grew full. The people who managed those enclosures lived there year-round, not in the great walled city on the plateau, but in proximity to it, connected by paths worn smooth through decades of foot traffic and cattle hooves. When the time came to bring the cattle back, it was not done quietly. The movement of a large herd was, by its nature, a thing that announced itself, the low calling of animals that have grown accustomed to a place and do not yet trust the new direction, the sound of hooves on wet clay, the shouts of the younger herders keeping the flanks together. Those who lived along the path to the city would have heard it long before they saw it. Women carrying water from the cisterns near the eastern enclosure walls paused and tilted their heads, identifying the sound the way one identifies a familiar voice in a crowd, not from the words, but from the shape of the sound itself. The cattle of the plateau were not small animals. They were long-horned, deep-chested, their hides dark or dun, or a particular warm reddish-brown that seemed, in certain kinds of afternoon light, to mirror the color of the granite itself. They had been bred across generations for the specific conditions of this landscape, for the short dry season grasses, for the seasonal water sources, for the altitude and its thin, bright air. They carried in their bodies something of the land that had made them, the way all living things eventually do. The men who received them at the outer edges of the city's territory stood with the particular stillness of people, performing an act they have performed many times and do not need to hurry through. Soapstone vessels had been brought out, shallow bowls with the characteristic ringed carving around their rims, the kind of vessel made in workshops not far from the city, in places where the stone could be coaxed into shape with patient, unhurried tools. These bowls were not used for water or grain. They marked a threshold, in the way that thresholds in this place were often marked with objects that signified belonging, ownership, continuation. The count itself was carried out by two men who had done this work for many seasons. They did not count quickly. Each animal was observed, assessed, remembered, not by number alone, but by the particular markings, the condition of the horns, the way it moved, the number that would be recorded in the system of record-keeping that the city maintained. Was not merely a quantity, but a portrait of the herd's health, its losses over the wet season, its gains in the form of calves born on the northern ground. This information would move upward through the layers of the city's administration, translated into decisions about which animals would be kept and which would eventually become part of the redistribution that moved goods outward to allied chiefs, to distant settlements, to the networks of obligation that held the plateau's political life together. A small boy, perhaps 5 years old, sat on the top of a low stone wall nearby, watching with the complete, uncritical attention that small children bring to spectacle. He had been left there by his grandmother, who was occupied with something else entirely and had placed him on the wall, the way one places a jar on a shelf, with the expectation that he would remain where he was put. He did remain, but his eyes moved constantly. He watched the cattle with the particular intensity of a child who has not yet learned to take large animals for granted, who still finds in the size and slowness of them something that borders on the marvelous. Later, much later, when this child had grown into a man with his own place in the city's life, he would tell his own children about this morning. He would not remember it as a piece of administration, would not frame it in terms of trade or political economy or the redistribution of surplus. He would remember the color of the light, which was the diffuse, even light of a sky still carrying the memory of clouds. He would remember the smell of the wet earth and the cattle together, a smell that was not entirely pleasant and not entirely unpleasant, but was unmistakably the smell of the plateau in this particular season. He would remember the low stone wall under him, still cool from the night, warming slowly as he sat, the way it held the cold deep inside its granite mass, long after the air around it had turned soft. This is what cities pass on, perhaps more than their monuments or their records. These small deposits of experience, carried in individual memory, handed forward through story to the next generation of small children sitting on warm walls in the early afternoon. The cattle settled. The count was concluded. The soapstone bowls were taken back inside the enclosure walls, and the herders, who had walked the animals south from the northern pastures, accepted their food and their rest and lay down in the shade near the lesser enclosures, with the uncomplicated sleep of people who have done a long, useful thing and know it. The plateau breathed out, as it always did when the counting was finished. The herd was home. The numbers were held. Another season had been survived and measured and remembered, and the city continued to be what it had always been. Not a monument, frozen in stone, but a living organism, breathing in and breathing out, taking in its distant cattle and its foreign ceramics and the small, irreplaceable experiences of its children, and holding all of it, for a while, within its walls. As the afternoon deepened, the granite walls took on the amber color that came only in this transitional season, when the air still carried moisture, but the sun had returned to full strength, and the stone seemed almost to glow from within, as if remembering all the warmth it had ever been given, and releasing it slowly, gently, into the cooling air.